Welcome to debate. It's 2 a.m., you hear a knock at the door. Standing outside are two pale kids with solid, pitch black eyes. They ask to come in. The rule of the legend is simple. If you invite them in, you are doomed. Tonight, we explore the black-eyed children and the terrifying psychological reality of the monsters we willingly invite into our lives.
It really is a terrifying premise, honestly.
Right? We're looking at this not as a supernatural ghost story, but through the lens of our source material, which frames this American urban legend as a profound clinical psychology metaphor, specifically for toxic empathy and the devastating impact of energy vampires.
Exactly.
So I argue that human beings are fundamentally wired to help those in vulnerability, and that pathologizing our natural empathy as toxic risks making us cruel and heartless to people who are genuinely just going through a hard time.
Well, and I argue that extending compassion without strict boundaries is not a virtue, but a dangerous vulnerability, one that manipulators and narcissists rely on to gain entry and completely destroy your life.
To really unpack this, we need to start with the imagery that the legend relies on, because the aesthetic of the myth is deeply tied to how empathy actually functions in the human brain.
Right, the pale kids.
Yes. The myth doesn't feature an axe murderer kicking down your door.
No, it doesn't.
It features pale children standing in the cold late at night, asking for something as trivial and necessary as using your phone. From an evolutionary perspective, human beings are biologically and socially wired to respond to that exact stimulus.
You're talking about the biological imperative to protect the young.
Precisely. I mean, we possess mirror neurons. When we see a child in distress, or someone who appears vulnerable and helpless, those neurons fire. We physically simulate their discomfort in our own minds. Our neurochemistry compels us to assist. It is the very core of what makes us human and what has allowed our species to build cooperative societies. To look at a child or someone actively begging for help and simply lock the door, to ignore that plea, it feels inherently cruel because it goes against our neurological programming.
I see why you think that, but
when we start labeling the instinct to care as a vulnerability, or when we set impenetrable boundaries out of a generalized fear of manipulation, I believe we step into deeply selfish territory. We simply cannot go through life treating every person in distress as a potential monster in disguise.
I understand the biological imperative you are pointing to, but we have to decode the core mechanism of the legend, which mirrors clinical reality perfectly. The defining rule of the black-eyed children is that they cannot enter unless invited.
Right, the invitation.
Exactly. They do not break your windows, they do not pick your locks, they wait for you to open the door and verbally consent to their presence. I fiercely attack the idea of the unconditional open door, because that is exactly what we call toxic empathy.
Let's define that term, though, because toxic empathy gets thrown around a lot in popular psychology. How are you framing it here?
I am framing it clinically. Toxic empathy is what happens when your boundary regulation completely fails. It is empathy without self-preservation. In the psychological landscape, the energy vampires, and let's be clear, we aren't just talking about a needy friend here.
Okay, who are we talking about?
We are talking about individuals with high-trait narcissism, specifically covert narcissists or chronic manipulators who utilize learned helplessness. They do not announce their toxicity. They intentionally present themselves as helpless.
I see.
They wear the mask of the pale, shivering child precisely because they know it hijacks the exact mirror neurons you just described. They weaponize your pity.
I hear you, but let me give you a different perspective on human nature and really the societal cost of that kind of defensive posture. Let's think about this systematically. How can a society function if we are instructed to view every plea for help as a trap?
Society functions because we establish baselines of trust. But those baselines are meant for healthy individuals, not predators.
But you don't know who is at the door until you open it. Consider the analogy of a triage nurse in a crowded emergency room. Patients come in, crying, in pain, asking for intervention.
Right.
If that nurse operates under the assumption that every single crying patient is merely faking it to steal medication or waste resources, the entire medical system collapses.
Well,
The foundation of care is the presumption of genuine need. How are we in our daily lives supposed to differentiate a genuine cry for help from a manipulator knocking on the boundaries of our lives? Empathy requires a leap of faith. If we assume the person asking to use the phone is an energy vampire, we might be leaving a stranded, terrified person out in the cold.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why unconditional compassion is exactly what these predators are counting on, and why your triage nurse analogy actually proves my point entirely.
Wait, really? How so? The nurse operates on compassion.
No, the nurse operates on protocol.
Oh,
A triage nurse does not just blindly hand out medication to anyone who cries. They use diagnostics. They check vitals. They establish boundaries precisely because they know that drug-seeking behavior exists.
that's fair.
If they don't filter it out, they won't have resources left for the genuine emergencies. Manipulators specifically exploit your ethical hesitation. They know you are standing on the other side of that door, wrestling with your conscience.
So you're saying they rely on the fact that we don't want to be the bad guy.
Exactly. They act helpless, so you will rescue them. The debate here is about the method of entry. Toxic individuals do not knock on your boundaries with a battering ram, they knock with a sob story. Think about everyday scenarios.
Like what?
Think about the coworker who asks for a quick favor to review a document because they are just so overwhelmed, and suddenly you have spent your entire weekend doing their job. That is the black-eyed kid at the door of your cubicle.
Right.
They demand entry through your guilt and your obligation. They simulate distress so perfectly that you convince yourself you are doing a noble thing by letting them in. But the source material is explicitly clear. They exploit your kindness to initiate a breach.
I hear the workplace example, but let's look at the actual mechanism of what is being asked in the legend itself. They're asking to use the phone. In the real world, someone who is a chronic victim or who is struggling might just need a temporary safe harbor.
Wait, but is it ever just the phone?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, they need a small favor, a bit of your time, a momentary validation. Even if someone is a draining personality, offering them that temporary grace is a contained risk.
A contained risk?
Yeah, you let them use the phone, you give them a cup of coffee, you listen to their problem, and then they leave. Life is full of difficult, draining people who are not necessarily malevolent. Sometimes people just need to borrow a little bit of your strength until they recover. We have the capacity to regulate that interaction. We don't have to surrender our entire lives just because we open the door for 5 minutes.
And that right there is the exact cognitive distortion that destroys people's lives.
Destroys lives? Come on.
Yes, you are operating under the illusion of a contained risk. You think, oh, it's just a phone call. It's just 5 minutes. But I refute this using the clinical reality of the energy vampire, which is perfectly mirrored in the devastating rule of the legend. The source material warns us, once you let them into your life, your relationship, or your home, it is never temporary.
Because you believe the phone call is a trick.
It is a pretext. In psychology, we call this the foot in the door technique, originally studied by Friedman and Fraser.
Right, I'm familiar with that.
When you let someone in for a 5-minute phone call, you cross a psychological threshold. You've already subconsciously categorized this person as safe or deserving of help. So when they ask for a glass of water or to stay just a little longer, your brain uses confirmation bias to comply. Refusing the second, larger request would mean admitting your first decision to let them in was a mistake.
Ah, interesting.
That's how the technique actually bypasses your logical defenses. Once they have breached the perimeter of your boundaries, the dynamic shifts entirely. They begin a systematic, ruthless draining of your emotional, financial, and psychological resources.
But, you are suggesting a level of premeditated malice that I think is quite rare. Most people who drain us aren't sitting in a dark room scheming about how to destroy our psychological well-being. They are just deeply broken. They lack the tools to self-soothe. They latch on because they are drowning, not because they are evil.
It doesn't matter if the parasite's aware it's a parasite. The host still gets completely depleted. The clinical reality is that whether it is conscious malice or the unconscious black hole of a chronic victim's need, the result is identical.
But intent matters when we are talking about human connection.
Not when we are talking about survival and boundary enmeshment. They will not leave. You think you are offering a temporary harbor, but to them you have just signed a lease.
Wow.
Because crisis is how they guarantee your continued attention. Think about that friend who only ever calls when their life is falling apart. You pick up because you care, but 2 hours later, your own evening is ruined, your energy is completely depleted, and they haven't asked a single question about your day.
Right.
The phone call turns into a need for a ride, which turns into a need for a loan, which turns into an emotional dependency so profound that you are spending all your waking hours managing their anxiety.
You're describing compassion fatigue.
I am describing total emotional burnout resulting from enmeshed trauma bonds. They drain you until your sanity is compromised and your emotional reserves are empty. The legend says your life is ruined for a reason. Total depletion is the only outcome if you do not enforce the boundary at the door.
That is an incredibly bleak view of human interaction, though I admit the mechanics you're describing map perfectly onto certain toxic relationships we've all witnessed or experienced. It is true that when you engage with someone who has the psychological profile of an energy vampire, your own empathy becomes the very instrument of your exhaustion.
Exactly.
But I keep coming back to the chilling imagery of the black eyes.
The warning signs.
Precisely. In the legend, before you open the door, if you look closely, you can see that their eyes are solid, pitch black. It's a blatant warning sign. It signifies that there is no soul there, no reciprocity, just an endless void. Doesn't that imply that we have the ability to see the warning signs before we open the door?
Mm-hmm.
We can have empathy without being blind. We don't have to shut the door on everyone. We just have to look them in the eyes first.
Yes. We can see the signs, but only if we are willing to look at them instead of our own guilt. And that is where the metaphor reaches its most terrifying depth. Why do people ignore the black eyes in the story?
Well, because they're focused on the pale, shivering child. They're focused on the distress.
No, they ignore the black eyes because acknowledging them means you have to do the hard, painful thing of closing the door. You have to tolerate the discomfort of being the bad guy in their narrative.
Oh, man.
The black eyes in real life are the inconsistencies in a manipulator's story. They are the subtle boundary pushes early in a relationship. They are the lack of reciprocal care when you are the one who is tired. People see these signs, but their toxic empathy overrides their self-preservation. They tell themselves, oh, I can fix them. I can fill that void with my love. But you cannot fill a black hole.
Which brings us to the profound, heartbreaking realization embedded in this metaphor. When we synthesize what we are both saying, we arrive at a climax that is deeply unsettling.
It really is.
I still believe we must default to compassion, but you've convinced me that compassion without a diagnostic filter, without actively looking for those black eyes, is just self-sabotage. The true horror of the black-eyed children isn't the supernatural element. It isn't that they possess magical powers to break down your defenses. The horror is our own complicity in our destruction.
Precisely. They cannot enter unless invited. We are the architects of our own ruin. Inviting them in is like disabling your computer's firewall because you feel bad for the pop-up ad. It's not about the initial pop-up, it's about the malware that quietly installs itself in the background while you're trying to help.
That forces us to confront the fact that the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the dark woods, waiting to jump out from behind a tree. The most destructive forces in our lives are the people sitting in our living rooms, drinking our coffee, sleeping in our beds, people whom we consciously allowed in because we felt sorry for them. We handed them the keys to our psychological well-being because we couldn't bear the guilt of saying no.
We traded our survival for the comfort of feeling compassionate. And by the time we realize the extent of the drain, the door is already locked from the inside. The resources are gone. The exhaustion is absolute. The legend forces us to look in the mirror and ask why we are so eager to sacrifice ourselves to anyone who knows how to perform helplessness.
It is a devastating critique of how we manage our own humanity. As we draw this discussion to a close, we have to recognize the immense weight of what this source material is trying to communicate. I maintain that empathy is our greatest trait, but I have to acknowledge the terrifying reality you've outlined, that empathy can be and often is used as a Trojan horse by those who wish to consume our resources. The desire to help is beautiful, but without the armor of discernment, it is fatal.
And I will acknowledge that closing the door on vulnerability goes against our deepest, most profound human instincts. It is an incredibly painful boundary to enforce. It requires you to sit with the guilt of turning someone away. But as we've explored tonight, balancing our humanity with our need for psychological self-preservation is not optional. It is a matter of survival. There is so much more to explore in how we navigate these dynamics, but the core lesson of the myth remains absolute.
Listen to your instincts. When you see the black eyes, lock the door. Because once you let them in, they never truly leave.